Right now, a U.S. aircraft carrier is racing across the ocean with a 7-day deadline. In Iran, a currency just died so violently that 70% of the population can't afford food anymore. And between them sits a narrow strip of water that 20% of the world's oil flows through every single day. This isn't a war story. This is a balance sheet crisis disguised as a geopolitical standoff. Because when a regime that controls 2 million barrels of oil per day collapses, it doesn't just break a country. It forces every central bank, every pension fund, and every government on earth to reprice reality all at once. That's what we call a reset. And if you want to understand how a collapsing currency in Tehran could empty your bank account in 6 months, you need to stay until the end of this video, because what breaks first, markets, currencies, or people, is about to be decided in the next 7 days. Part 1. The 7-day balance sheet. Let's start with what's happening right now, not in headlines, but in ship movements. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group just got pulled out of the South China Sea and ordered to steam at full speed toward the Middle East. This isn't a routine deployment. This is the Pentagon moving one of its biggest chess pieces across the board with a stopwatch running. The carrier isn't alone. It's traveling with 3 destroyers, the USS Spruance, the USS Michael Murphy, and the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. These aren't just boats with guns. They're mobile missile defense platforms designed to intercept threats before they hit high-value targets. The fact that they're all moving together tells you this isn't about intimidation. It's about preparation. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. They're expected to arrive in 6 to 7 days. Not weeks, not months, days. That timeline isn't just a military detail. It's a countdown clock for every market analyst, oil trader, and central banker on the planet. Because in financial terms, 6 to 7 days is the window where uncertainty turns into pricing pressure. It's the gap between we're monitoring the situation and we need to hedge our entire position right now. Let me explain why this matters economically, not just strategically. When a carrier strike group moves, it sends a non-verbal signal to global markets. It tells investors that the United States government believes something serious enough is about to happen, that it's worth repositioning billions of dollars in military hardware. And markets don't wait to see what happens. They reprice risk immediately. Oil futures start ticking up. Currency hedges get activated. Sovereign debt yields shift, all before a single shot is fired. Now add this. The US has already started pulling personnel out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That's one of the largest American military installations in the region, and it's being treated as vulnerable. When you see assets being moved away from forward positions, that's not caution. That's capital flight logic applied to military strategy. You don't retreat unless you expect the cost of staying to exceed the cost of leaving. Iran knows this too. Tehran has already closed its airspace to most civilian traffic and issued what's called a NOTAM, a notice to airmen, warning of potential military activity. That's not saber-rattling. That's a logistics shutdown. It means the country is preparing its infrastructure for conflict, which in economic terms means supply chains are about to snap. Here's the precedent you need to understand. Markets don't react when wars start. They react when wars become inevitable. In January of 1991, oil prices spiked $25 per barrel in the 2 weeks before Operation Desert Storm began, not after. The repricing happens when uncertainty becomes certainty. And right now, we're in that window. The 7-day clock isn't just a military deadline. It's the horizon where speculation becomes reality, where risk premiums get baked into every contract, every derivative, every pension fund allocation on Earth. The carrier group isn't just heading toward Iran, it's heading toward a repricing event. So when people ask, why does this matter to me? The answer is simple. Because your retirement account, your gas prices, and your grocery bill are all tied to the assumptions markets are making right now about what happens when that strike group arrives. And those assumptions are about to get stress tested. Part 2. A currency that died loudly. Now let's talk about why the carrier is even moving in the first place. Because this didn't start with the Pentagon. It started with a currency. On December 28, 2025, protests erupted across Iran. Not small demonstrations, not isolated unrest, a nationwide uprising that spread to dozens of cities in a matter of days. And the spark wasn't ideology, it wasn't religion, it wasn't politics, it was the total collapse of the Iranian rial. In the span of 1 year, the rial lost 84% of its value. Let me put that in terms that make sense. If you had saved 100,000 rials at the start of 2025, by the end of the year, you had 16,000 rials of purchasing power left. Your savings didn't shrink, they evaporated. Food inflation hit 70%. 70. That's not an economic statistic, that's a biological threshold. When the majority of a population can't afford to eat, social order doesn't fray, it snaps. Because you can suppress political dissent, you can control information, you can arrest organizers, but you can't arrest hunger. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys legitimacy. Because the implicit deal every government makes with its people is this: we control the money, and in exchange, the money works. When money stops working, when a week's salary can't buy a week's food, that deal is over. And here's the thing about hyperinflation: it's fast. It doesn't give you time to adapt. 1 month you're struggling, the next month you're desperate. The month after that, you're in the streets. The protests spread faster than the government could respond. Reports indicate that between 2,000 and 6,000 people have been killed by security forces. Over 10,000 have been detained. Those aren't propaganda numbers. Those are the estimates from human rights monitors trying to track a crackdown happening in real time. But here's what the regime didn't account for. You can't shoot your way out of a currency crisis. History is very clear on this. When money dies, governments fall. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The pattern is always the same. The currency collapses, the government prints more. Inflation spirals, people lose faith. And once faith is gone, no amount of force brings it back. Because money is just trust in numeric form. And when that trust evaporates, so does power. Iran's government is now facing the one thing sanctions could never accomplish: a population that has nothing left to lose. Because when your life savings disappear and your children are hungry, the risk of protesting becomes smaller than the risk of staying silent. And that's when internal collapse becomes a geopolitical event. Because President Trump has publicly messaged Iranian protesters, telling them that help is on its way. That's not diplomatic language. That's a signal. It tells the protesters that the United States is considering intervention, and it tells the regime that the clock is ticking. The carrier strike group isn't heading toward Iran to start a crisis. It's heading there because the crisis has already started, and it started with a collapsing currency that made revolution inevitable. This is the part people miss. The military is reacting, not initiating. The real trigger was economic. The rial died, and it died loudly enough that the entire world is now repositioning around what happens next. Part 3. Oil. The hidden operating system. Now, we get to the part where a national crisis becomes a global contagion, and it all comes down to oil. Iran exports roughly 2 million barrels of oil per day. In a global market that moves about 100 million barrels daily, 2 million doesn't sound like much. It's 2% of total supply. But here's the thing about oil markets. They don't absorb shocks. They reprice them violently. Because oil isn't traded on abundance, it's traded on the margin. The last barrel sets the price for every barrel. So when 2 million barrels disappear from the global supply, it doesn't create a 2% problem. It creates a pricing crisis. Let me explain how this works. Right now, the global oil market is roughly balanced. Supply and demand are tight, but manageable. But if Iran's 2 million barrels per day suddenly vanish, whether from sanctions, war, or regime collapse, the market tips into deficit. And when markets go into deficit, prices don't rise gradually, they spike. Analysts are estimating that Brent crude, the global benchmark, could hit $90 per barrel or higher. That's not a worst-case scenario. That's the baseline expectation if Iranian oil stops flowing. But it gets worse. Because Iran doesn't just export oil, it controls the Strait of Hormuz. This is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman, and 20% of the world's oil passes through it every single day. It's 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and if Iran decides to close it, either by mining the waterway, threatening tankers, or outright military blockade, the entire global energy system locks up. We're not talking about a supply squeeze anymore. We're talking about a choke point shutdown. And here's the pricing mechanic. The moment the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested, every oil tanker on Earth that needs to pass through it has to get insurance. And that insurance, called war risk premium, costs money, a lot of money. Experts predict an immediate $10 to $20 per barrel premium on all oil the moment that choke point is threatened. Not closed, threatened. That premium doesn't just hit oil companies, it hits everyone, because oil is the input cost for everything. Shipping, manufacturing, plastics, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals. When oil spikes, the entire cost structure of the global economy shifts upward. And here's who pays first. Importers, then insurers, then consumers. Your gas price doesn't go up because oil got more expensive. It goes up because every middleman in the supply chain had to reprice their risk, and that cost gets passed down the line until it lands on you at the pump. But let's zoom out even further. Energy isn't just a commodity. It's the operating system of modern civilization. Every economy on Earth is built on the assumption that energy will be cheap and available. When that assumption breaks, everything built on top of it starts to wobble. Food prices rise because farming is energy intensive. Shipping costs spike because freight runs on diesel. Manufacturing slows because factories need power. And inflation, real, persistent, ugly inflation, takes root in the economy. This is how a regional collapse becomes a global event. Because oil is the transmission vector. It's the system through which instability spreads from one country to the entire world. And Iran sits right in the middle of it. Part 4. Stagflation is the reset mechanism. So now we have spiking energy costs, and we have slowing economic growth because higher costs mean businesses pull back, consumers spend less, and confidence evaporates. This combination has a name: stagflation. It's the nightmare scenario for central banks, because it puts them in a position where every tool they have makes the problem worse. Let me explain the trap. When inflation is high, central banks are supposed to raise interest rates to cool down the economy. But when growth is slowing, they're supposed to cut rates to stimulate activity. Stagflation means you have both problems at once: high inflation and low growth. So what do? If you raise rates, you kill growth even more. If you cut rates, you make inflation worse. There's no good move, only bad options and worse options. And right now, central banks around the world have been planning to cut interest rates in 2026 because they thought inflation was under control. But if oil spikes to $90 per barrel, those plans are dead. You can't cut rates while energy-driven inflation is ripping through the economy. So rate cuts get cancelled. And the markets that were pricing in those cuts, stock markets, bond markets, real estate markets, have to reprice immediately. Analysts are warning of a 10% or larger correction in global equities if this scenario plays out. That's not a bear market yet, but it's the beginning of one. Because a 10% drop doesn't happen in isolation. It triggers margin calls. It forces pension funds to rebalance. It makes sovereign debt harder to service. Here's what that means in plain terms. Your retirement account takes a hit. Government budgets get squeezed. Borrowing costs go up for everyone. And the political pressure becomes unmanageable, because inflation is the one economic problem that voters feel immediately and personally. When food and gas prices spike, approval ratings collapse. Governments face pressure to do something, which usually means price controls, subsidies, or other interventions that make the underlying problem worse. This is what a reset looks like. Not a coordinated policy shift, not a planned restructuring, a forced repricing of every assumption the global economy was built on. And the mechanism is stagflation. Because stagflation doesn't just slow growth, it breaks the monetary policy toolkit that governments rely on to manage crises. That's why this matters. It's not just about Iran. It's about what happens when central banks run out of moves and markets realize there's no safety net left. Part 5. The shadow fleet gets exposed. Now let's talk about the part of the global economy that most people don't see. The shadow fleet. For years, Iran has been under heavy sanctions. Officially, it's not supposed to be selling oil to most of the world, but in reality, it's been selling millions of barrels through a parallel system of ships, shell companies, and middlemen designed to evade detection. This network connects Iran to Russia and Venezuela, three countries that are all under varying degrees of sanctions. Together, they've built an informal trade system that operates outside the traditional banking and shipping infrastructure. Here's how it works. Iranian oil gets loaded onto tankers that turn off their tracking systems. The tankers meet other ships in the middle of the ocean and transfer the oil. The oil gets relabeled, new paperwork gets created, and by the time it reaches a port, it looks like it came from somewhere else entirely. It's not efficient, it's not cheap, but it works. And it's been keeping Iran's economy alive despite sanctions that were supposed to cripple it. But here's the thing about shadow systems. They only work as long as all the participants stay in the game. The moment one of them collapses, the whole network unravels. If the Iranian regime falls, this entire parallel trade system disappears overnight. Because the new government, whatever it looks like, won't have the same relationships, the same infrastructure, or the same incentives to maintain it. Contracts get voided, shipping routes collapse. Currency dependencies that were built on Iran's shadow economy lose their counterparties. And this creates a cascading effect. Russia loses a key sanctions evasion partner. Venezuela loses a buyer. The shipping companies that specialized in this grey market trade lose their business model. The insurers who quietly covered these transactions get stuck with stranded liabilities. This is what it means when we say reset. It's not just about Iran. It's about all the informal systems that were built around Iran. Systems that involve billions of dollars in trade, energy futures, and currency swaps. When those systems snap, the formal economy has to absorb the shock. And that absorption process isn't smooth, it's chaotic. Energy contracts have to be renegotiated. Shipping insurance gets repriced. Futures markets have to account for supply chains that no longer exist. And here's the regional breakdown. Emerging markets get hit hardest because they rely more heavily on informal trade networks and cheaper, sanction-evading oil. Developed markets have more cushion, but they're not immune. Because global finance is interconnected, and when parallel systems collapse, the ripple effects don't stop at borders. This is why regime collapse is different from regime change. Change can be managed. Collapse is disorderly. And disorderly transitions destroy value faster than any war. The shadow fleet isn't just about oil. It's about all the dependencies, financial, logistical, political, that were built on the assumption that Iran's regime would stay in power. And when that assumption breaks, everything built on top of it has to be rebuilt from scratch. That's the reset, not a choice, a requirement. Part 6. The nuclear red line and the human cost. Now we need to talk about the worst-case scenario, because there's one variable we haven't fully addressed yet: nuclear weapons. In June of 2025, the US and Israel conducted a 12-day military campaign targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. The strikes were meant to set back Iran's nuclear program and prevent it from reaching breakout capability, the point where it could produce a bomb in a matter of weeks. But the strikes didn't eliminate the program, they delayed it. And now, with the regime facing collapse, there's a terrifying strategic calculation on the table. Does Iran attempt a nuclear breakout as a last-ditch survival tactic? Here's the logic from Tehran's perspective. If the regime believes it's going to fall anyway, the only thing that might prevent a US-backed transition of power is the threat of nuclear retaliation. It's not about using a weapon, it's about having one. Because once you have a nuclear weapon, the entire game changes. Regime change becomes exponentially more dangerous. International intervention becomes politically unthinkable. You go from being a failing state to being a nuclear-armed failing state, and those don't get invaded. This is why the next 7 days matter so much strategically, because the longer the regime has, the more desperate it becomes, and desperation makes the nuclear option more attractive. But let's be clear about something. Every strategic calculation, every market reprice, every geopolitical reset, it all gets paid for by civilians first. If this crisis escalates, the people who suffer aren't policymakers or investors. They're ordinary Iranians who are already facing hyperinflation, food shortages, and violent crackdowns. Displacement becomes inevitable. Millions of people could be forced to flee if full-scale conflict breaks out, or if the regime collapses into a power vacuum. Food insecurity, which is already critical, gets worse. Medical supply chains break down. basic infrastructure fails. And here's the hard truth about economic resets. They're not clean. They're not surgical. They don't just reorganize balance sheets. They destroy lives. The moral cost of what's happening right now isn't abstract. It's measured in families that lose everything. Children who go hungry. People who die because hospitals run out of medicine, or because they were in the wrong place when the shooting started. There are two possible endgames here. One is a managed transition, where international actors coordinate to stabilize the country, install a transitional government, and prevent total collapse. That's the optimistic scenario, and even that one involves massive human suffering. The other is a power vacuum, competing factions, regional proxies, a failed state in the middle of the world's most strategic energy corridor. And if that happens, the reset isn't just economic, it's humanitarian. Because when a country of 85 million people collapses, the spillover effects don't stay contained. Refugee crises, sectarian violence, proxy wars, state failure. This is the part that doesn't make it into the financial models. The human cost. The lives disrupted, destroyed, or ended because a currency collapsed and a regime couldn't hold. And here's the thing we need to say out loud. None of this is inevitable. Crises create choices. And the choices made in the next 7 days will determine whether this becomes a managed transition or a generational catastrophe. But right now, the clock is ticking. The carrier strike group is 6 days away. The regime is backed into a corner. The markets are repricing, and the world is holding its breath. Because what happens next doesn't just reset Iran's economy. It resets everyone's.